Recall the best meal you have ever tasted. A steaming, thick bowl of bone broth, a piece of crispy fried chicken that shatters perfectly against your teeth, or simply a bag of savory snacks that forces you to lick every fingertip. Unable to stop, there is an invisible magic lurking within those foods. It isn't sweet, it isn't sour, it isn't salty, nor is it bitter. It is a profound seduction, a silent call from the tip of your tongue, compelling your brain to crave just one more bite, and then another. But what if I told you that the magic creating this perfection is, in fact, the most cursed and shunned culprit in the culinary history of humanity? You walk into your favorite Chinese restaurant. The orange chicken arrives, glistening with a perfect golden hue. You take a bite. It's incredible. The savory richness bursts in your mouth. Then suddenly, a friend at the table lowers their chopsticks and hesitates. I bet this place uses MSG. Isn't that stuff highly toxic for you? You freeze. Your eyes drift to the no MSG sign, hastily taped to the restaurant's glass door to reassure patrons. You start to feel anxious about your meal. But here lies the greatest lie. That white powder, chased away, stigmatized, and viewed as the seed of illness, is actually sitting obediently inside the bag of Doritos you snacked on this afternoon. It hides within the crispy coating of your KFC chicken, clings tightly to your Pringles, and sneaks into the bottle of ranch dressing tucked away in your fridge. They didn't remove it. They just cleverly disguised it under a different name. The brutal controversy surrounding MSG did not begin in medical science laboratories. It started with a harmless letter in 1968. Today, let's reverse the wheel of time to discover what MSG truly is, how it was born, and why an essence of nature became the victim of the greatest psychological manipulation of the century. MSG is not a cold chemical invention born from a laboratory accident. Its story begins on a peaceful evening in Japan. In the year 1908, Dr. Kikune Ikeda, a quiet chemist, was sitting at his dining table. His wife had just served a steaming bowl of dashi, a traditional broth made from kombu kelp. As Ikeda took a sip, he froze. A profound, savory, and elegant richness spread across his tongue. He realized that this exquisite flavor could not be explained by the four basic tastes humanity knew: sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. It was something entirely distinct. It was the same richness you perceive when eating aged cheese, a ripe tomato, a mushroom, or a perfectly fire-grilled steak. Ikeda named it umami, meaning pleasant savory taste. He became obsessed with it. What was creating this miracle? Taking the kombu leaves back to his lab, Ikeda locked himself away for grueling months. Through complex extraction and crystallization processes, he finally found the heart of umami. It was glutamic acid, an amino acid naturally occurring in nature, a building block of life itself. When he combined it with sodium to create stability, he successfully synthesized monosodium glutamate, or as we call it, MSG. Ikeda tasted it. And there it was, that exact, savory, profound depth of the dashi broth from that night, now concentrated into a pure white crystalline powder, sparkling like morning dew. In 1909, with a burning desire to bring delicious and nutritious meals to the Japanese people, Ikeda founded a company named Ajinomoto, which literally translates to the essence of taste. From the ocean's kelp, MSG began its journey beyond Japan's borders, spreading to China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. By the 1930s, that sparkling powder had become the indispensable soul in the kitchens of millions of Asian families. But the modern birth of MSG does not begin in a laboratory flask. It begins much earlier, in fields flooded with heat and light. Sugarcane, corn, cassava, sugar beets, ordinary crops, quiet crops, crops so familiar that no one would ever look at them and imagine the white crystals of umami waiting inside. But that is exactly where the process begins. Modern MSG is produced from plant-based feedstocks. Their sugars are extracted, refined into glucose, and sent forward into fermentation tanks, where microbes begin the real transformation. In modern glutamate production, Corynebacterium glutamicum has become one of the key industrial workhorses, and glucose is one of its major starting carbon sources. And that is the first great illusion of MSG. People imagine something harsh, synthetic, violent, artificial in the ugliest sense of the word. But the truth is stranger than the myth. The factory does not begin by manufacturing flavor from nothing. It begins by feeding life. The extracted sugar enters the production line as a clear, innocent liquid. But once it crosses into the fermentation section, innocence ends. Here, the plant's sugar is no longer food for people. It becomes food for microbes. Invisible organisms are introduced into the tanks. And from that moment forward, the building is no longer just a factory. It is an engineered habitat, a place where microscopic life is allowed to work under human command. Picture the scene. A row of sealed industrial vessels, steel walls, quiet vibration, low mechanical hum, pipes feeding in nutrients, operators reading values, a process that looks calm from the outside, while inside, billions of cells are feeding, multiplying, and reshaping matter molecule by molecule. This is not the romance of old cooking. This is controlled fermentation. And fermentation is the key word, because that single word destroys one of the biggest lies ever told about MSG. The modern process belongs to the same broad family of microbial transformation humans have used for centuries in foods like yogurt, bread, kimchi, and wine. The difference is scale, control, and purpose. Here, the goal is not alcohol, not gas, not sourness. The goal is glutamic acid, the molecular core of umami itself. Now the real alchemy begins. The microbes consume glucose, not dramatically, not in flames, not with theatrical chemical explosions. They consume it silently, through metabolism, one of the oldest forces in life. Carbon flows inward, cellular machinery turns, energy is spent, pathways open, and as the process continues, the broth becomes richer and richer in glutamic acid. Industrial reviews of glutamate production describe this as microbial fermentation, built around Corynebacterium glutamicum, precisely because this organism is exceptionally useful for producing glutamate family amino acids at scale. And this is where the scene should feel almost unsettling, because if you stood inside a modern MSG plant, you would not witness a grand culinary event. You would witness patience. No chef tossing flames, no dramatic spice clouds, no sizzling pan, just tanks. Tanks full of liquid, carrying one of the most powerful taste molecules in the human food system. That is what makes the process so eerie. Something associated with comfort, hunger, pleasure, and craving is not born in spectacle. It is born in discipline and monitored biological labor, in a place where the deepest flavor in a bowl of soup starts as crop sugar, disappearing into microbial work. And hour by hour, the broth changes. At first, it is just feed, then it becomes culture, then it becomes production, and slowly, almost invisibly, sweetness is being converted into savoriness. That transformation is the emotional center of modern MSG manufacturing, because it reveals what umami really is. Not a fake taste imposed on food, but a naturally occurring molecule concentrated through a controlled biological process. The glutamate released in industrial fermentation is the same glutamate molecule associated with umami in many foods and in the body. The source may differ. The chemistry does not. That is the part fear could never survive. The body does not ask whether glutamate came from a tomato, a mushroom, a long-simmered broth, or a fermentation tank. A molecule has no nationality, no accent, no cultural passport. Once it exists as glutamate, it exists as glutamate. But the factory still is not finished. Because what the tank holds now is not the final powder people recognize. It is not yet the neat white crystal poured from a packet or shaken over noodles. It is still a living process broth, a mixture shaped by microbial labor, dissolved compounds, moisture, and the residue of production. The umami has been born, but it has not yet been purified. Ajinomoto's own description of the process says the microbes consume the glucose and release glutamic acid, which is then neutralized into a solution containing MSG before purification. Crystallization and drying begin. So part 3 is not really the story of powder. It is the story of conversion. Field into sugar, sugar into glucose, glucose into fermentation, fermentation into glutamic acid, and glutamic acid into the threshold of MSG. That threshold matters because once the fermentation phase is complete, the process changes character. Biology begins to step back. Engineering steps forward. What has been born in liquid form must now be cleaned, clarified, concentrated, crystallized, and made stable enough to enter global food supply chains. And that is where the next chapter becomes colder, cleaner, and even more unnerving, because part 4 is where the living broth loses its softness. It enters purification. It enters decolorization. It enters crystallization. And finally, it becomes the immaculate white face the world learned to fear. And now the process changes its face. Part 3 was about life, about microbes, about invisible labor, about sugar disappearing into fermentation. But Part 4 is different. This is where life begins to step back, and machinery takes control. What leaves the fermentation tank is not the final product the world recognizes. It is not yet that clean white crystal resting inside a seasoning packet. It is still a processed broth, wet, cloudy, heavy with dissolved compounds, biological residue, and the unfinished history of its own creation. The umami molecule is there, but it is buried. So now the factory begins its coldest act. It starts removing everything that is not the final truth. First, the glutamic acid-rich broth is neutralized into a solution containing MSG. Then that solution is decolorized and filtered. The dark traces are taken out. The cloudiness is stripped away. What was once murky and alive with fermentation is forced into clarity. And that is one of the most important psychological moments in the entire process, because the product stops looking biological and starts looking industrially pure. This sequence, neutralization, decolorization, filtration, crystallization, and drying, is how Ajinomoto describes the modern manufacturing flow for MSG. Picture that transformation. A liquid once born from microbial metabolism now moves through steel lines and purification systems. Filters hold back unwanted remnants. Color is erased. Suspended matter disappears. The broth becomes cleaner, then clearer, then almost unnaturally precise. This is not cooking anymore. This is refinement. And refinement has its own kind of violence. Because the factory is not trying to preserve the romance of fermentation, it is trying to extract only what matters, only the molecule, only the function, only the taste. Once the solution is purified, it enters the next stage. Concentration. Water is removed under controlled conditions, and the MSG solution becomes denser, stronger, heavier with possibility. Then comes the moment that feels almost magical, even inside an industrial plant. Crystallization. Ajinomoto states that the pure MSG solution is crystallized using an evaporator, and the resulting crystals are then dried to produce the final product. And that is where the illusion of simplicity is born, because crystallization makes the product look innocent. A clear solution becomes ordered matter. Dissolved molecules begin to align. Structure emerges. The invisible becomes visible. Tiny white crystals begin to appear. Not chaotic, not dirty, not accidental, but organized, disciplined, repeated, one after another. This is the stage where the entire process seems to become emotionally deceptive, because now the product looks so clean, so minimal, so harmless, that nobody seeing it for the first time would imagine the fields, the glucose, the microbes, the fermentation control, the purification systems, and the engineering discipline required to bring it here. Then comes drying. This is where the product loses the last trace of its liquid past. Moisture is driven off. Stability is created. Flowability is achieved. What remains is the form the world knows best. A dry, white crystalline powder, not broth, not extract, not paste. Powder, portable, measurable, packable, something that can move through factories, warehouses, supply chains, supermarket shelves, restaurant kitchens, snack plants, soup lines, instant noodle sachets, seasoning packets, and the hidden corners of modern processed food. Ajinomoto's official process description explicitly identifies drying as the final production step after evaporator crystallization. And this is the moment where MSG becomes psychologically dangerous to the public imagination, because people do not fear complexity when they can see it. They fear simplicity when they do not understand where it came from. A bubbling broth feels natural. A stalk of sugarcane feels natural. A tomato feels natural. A mushroom feels natural. But a white crystal feels clinical, detached, abstract, suspect. That is the paradox. The more purified MSG becomes, the easier it is for fear to project itself onto it. The cleaner the crystal, the dirtier the myth attached to it. And still, the line continues, because modern food factories do not exist to create one beautiful batch. They exist to create the same batch again and again and again. Consistency becomes law. The crystal size must be controlled. The dryness must be controlled. The appearance must be controlled. The handling must be controlled. The goal is not poetry. The goal is repeatability. That is what industrial perfection really means. Not a moment of brilliance, but the elimination of surprise. Every bag must behave like the last bag. Every shipment must resemble the last shipment. Every grain must dissolve, season, and perform with the same obedient precision. And so the product moves forward into the final stages of the modern line. Screening, handling, storage, packaging. The molecule that began in crops and passed through microbial life now becomes a market-ready ingredient. This is where flavor fully enters capitalism. It receives a package, a label, a transport identity, and a place inside the global food machine. The essence of taste is no longer a scientific breakthrough or a fermentation intermediate. It is inventory. But even here, the process has one more twist, because the modern factory does not only think about the crystal, it thinks about everything left behind. Ajinomoto describes a biocycle in which nutrient-rich co-products from amino acid fermentation are reused as fertilizer and feed rather than simply discarded. The company says co-product conversion from amino acid fermentation production is nearly 100%, turning what would once have been waste into agricultural support material that loops back toward the land. And that detail changes the emotional meaning of the whole system, because suddenly the factory is no longer just a place that consumes raw material. It becomes part of a loop. The field feeds the sugar feeds the microbes produce the glutamate becomes MSG, and what remains can return to nourish agriculture again. So when you hold a spoonful of MSG in your hand, what are you really holding? Not a mystery powder, not a synthetic curse, not a culinary villain. You are holding sunlight converted into crops reduced into sugar consumed by microbial workers, microbial labor purified by steel made clarity turned into crystal, and crystal refined into one of the most efficient flavor tools humanity has ever industrialized. That is the real face of modern MSG, not chaos, not poison, not scandal, precision. And that is exactly what makes the next chapter so disturbing. Because after all this order, after all this control, after all this biological intelligence and industrial discipline, the world still chose to trust a rumor more than the process. When the wave of panic subsided, scientists got to work to uncover the truth. Study after study, decade after decade. The FDAU, the Food and Drug Administration, launched large-scale reviews. International health organizations stepped in, and the final conclusion was delivered definitively. In normal amounts, MSG is completely safe. The FDA classified it under the GRAS, generally recognized as safe category, standing in the exact same ranks as salt and sugar. In the strictest double-blind test, where participants had no idea if they were eating MSG or a placebo, those numbness symptoms almost never appeared. Today, the world consumes more MSG than ever before. Prestigious Western head chefs like David Chang have strongly stood up to defend the honor of MSG because of one simple truth. It makes food taste better. It doesn't mask flavors. It elevates them. A tiny pinch of MSG can give a pot of soup profound depth and make a stir-fry infinitely more complex and complete. Now, let's return to the Chinese restaurant from the beginning. You sit there, the orange chicken, still glistening with its perfect golden hue. But your mindset has changed. You know that MSG is made from fermenting sugar, as elegant as the way we make yogurt. You know that the fear stemmed from a baseless, speculative letter. And you know that glutamate has flowed in the culinary veins of humanity for thousands of years. The next time someone looks at your plate and expresses fear about MSG, just smile, because you understand the difference between baseless rumors and genuine science. You understand how cultural prejudice can distort the truth about an essence of nature. That is the process. We uncover the truth about how the world works through every quiet story. If there are any mysteries you want us to explore next, let us know. For now, trust the process and fully enjoy your meal.